Alrighty, everyone, we'll get started. As people are finding their seats and such, we'll dive in. So my name is Chris. I'm part of the organizing committee for the Sports Analytics Conference here. Wanted to thank you all for coming and talk a little bit about how the event's going to work. But first, the hackathon is a bit unique. So it's over 2 days. So right now is the final round. And yesterday we had the first round, where we had about 38 participants across about 20 different teams. So mix of undergrad students, graduate students, and professionals. They were there in this room from about 9 a.m. till about 4:30 p.m. So, I think everyone had a good time. Lunch was served, got to meet some people, network a bit. But it was a really fun day. And there was a round of presentations yesterday at the end of the day, where teams only got 2 minutes to present. Now this is the final round where they'll be presenting for about 5 minutes each, with 5 minutes of Q&A from our judges and then also from the audience as well. We'll quickly just introduce our finalists. If when I say your name, you'll want to stand up and wave. So we'll start with, on the student division, we'll start with Xander and Lorenzo. Then we have Bella, Shreyan and Gathungu. Then we've got John Henry and Colin, Lucas, and Hunter and Andrew. Let's give them a round of applause for... Alrighty, and then I will hand it over to Carlos, who is our partner from the Ticketmaster side, who was instrumental in getting us all the data and the prompt. So Carlos, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for being here. Yesterday was a whole lot of fun, and also I wanted to make sure I took the time to thank, I know you said I was instrumental. There's a couple people, Sean Puckter right here. Sean, I'm gonna make you wave at everybody. Sean was the one that actually really helped get the data pulled together from the Ticketmaster side, and so team effort across the board. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the prompt and the data that we made available to the contestants. On the Ticketmaster and LiveAnalytics side, which LiveAnalytics is our global client analytics practice where we're working directly with our clients across all segments of live entertainment and making sure that they have the data that's going to help make their business a little bit better. Ticketmaster sits on top of the world's largest live entertainment database, so we take a look at all of the demographic, psychographic, behavioral, and transactional data that's at our fingertips. All in all, with just specific data points all the way to modeled stuff, we have about 220 different data points that we can look at for most records within our ecosystem. So as we sat down to figure out what prompt we wanted to put together, our faces were probably very similar to the contestants' faces yesterday morning at 9 a.m. We were looking at this massive data set going, all right, what are we gonna do with this? And we talked and talked and talked, and we came up with what we thought was a pretty interesting prompt. So what we did was we exposed 25,000 records in Virginia Beach, Louisville, and Kansas City, put that into the contestants' hands, and asked them to pick a league and expand to one of those cities, and then tell us why. So really cool opportunity for them to get into a lot of the propensity scores and the financial and spending metrics that are available, both at a record level and at an aggregated level for each of those different markets. And the fun part about it was the diversity of the answers that actually came out of it. I don't know if it was mildly frustrating or fun for you guys, the fact that there wasn't an answer that was gonna be displayed at the end of this thing, but I loved it because it gave creative control for them to do what they would like with the data set, but also bring in secondary research. Wealth of information available outside of our data set that most of these groups took advantage of and made their cases a lot stronger. So very excited to see the final presentations. On behalf of Ticketmaster, many thanks to everybody for presenting, participating, and even being here to listen, and very excited to see what you guys have. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Carlos. We're gonna get started. So Lorenzo and Xander, you are the first from the student division. And one thing I forgot to mention, also as another thank you to from the Ticketmaster team, the Winner of the student division and the winner of the open division, they'll be each receiving $750 voucher in Ticketmaster. So wanted to say that so everyone can feel the intensity of these presentations over the next hour and a half or so. And we will let our speakers go for 5 minutes. Then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A from the judges. If the judges don't have any or have finished their questions, we'll open it up to the audience as well. So Raghav and I will be around if you want to raise your hand, and we'll run the microphone over to you.
This working? You guys can hear me? Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, we will get going then. I am Xander Schwartz. This is Lorenzo Duby, and we are presenting the case for Kansas City hockey today and why we believe in the ascension of the Kansas City Mavericks, with apologies to Mark Cuban for the name infringement, from the AA Hockey League up to the NHL.
So to frame the problem, we wanted to find something empirical to evaluate. So we decided to choose ticket sales. In order to evaluate this, we started off with a micro model, trying to figure out event spend per user using their financial status, life stage from youth to career building right through retirement, and their previous ticket buying history. We did this across all of the data in order to create a level playing field normalized for all 3 cities. And then we applied this model to the expected fan base in each city for each sport. To do this, we used a random forest regression model because of its ability to handle categorical and continuous data.
So to give a first look at what the results look like, we did this for each of the 3 cities and calculated what the average spend per event per customer was in each of these 3 cities. So we found per event that Kansas City was in first place, followed by Louisville shortly thereafter, but with a little bit under $250, followed by a little bit of a gap, and then Virginia Beach. We also noticed that Virginia Beach had the lowest standard deviation on this number, which kind of indicates that they probably have both the least money, both just holistically, but as well as on both tails, which we thought was somewhat significant.
Next, to create the macro setting to apply that model to, we looked at the expected fan base for each sport for each city. We did this using fan propensity scores for each city for each sport. We used the top 50 percentile for each sport. If you look at the dotted brackets on the bottom part, those are what we evaluated as super fans, which were set by a metric that was included in the data set. So we thought this was of interest because on average, a super fan will spend about 21% more per event that they attend.
So then we can combine these 2 ideas into an overall expected revenue number, basically saying we have how many fans we think will purchase tickets, and we know what we think they will spend on average relative to the population size. And we saw, if you can see the blue chart on the far left, that Kansas City hockey is by far the largest number at about $117 million of projected revenue. This is also pretty significant because in the NHL, according to our research, about 37% of their overall revenue comes from that ticket revenue. It's also pretty in line with other similar NHL teams. For example, the St. Louis Blues, same state, similar market. They have a 30% larger population, but they were only at 130 million. So 120 million, 117 million more precisely. Pretty similar number in line with other NHL franchises, and definitely beats out what we saw in Louisville and Virginia by the same metrics. We also wanted to point out, though, that the only revenue, or sports are not the only revenue source for teams. There are other additional revenue sources that we can also look at through Ticketmaster. So we ran the exact same process on concert revenue, same random forest, same inputs, and then we could start to say, what do we think the city concert revenue would be, which we are less confident in these overall numbers because if you build a hockey stadium in Kansas City, they aren't just going to magically get all of the concert revenue, but it's a useful metric to look at. So you can see like the size of the circles. In the top far right, Kansas City has, as a city, the most overall concert revenue, followed by Virginia Beach and then Louisville. And also Kansas City, if they built a new hockey stadium, they would be the primary state-of-the-art indoor concert facility. So maybe you go to Arrowhead for a big Taylor Swift concert in the summer, but then during the winter, you could get a lot more revenue. Similarly, if you build a new hockey stadium in Kansas City, one thing we've seen across sports, you build a new stadium for a hockey or basketball team, they immediately start looking for another team. If you look at Seattle or you look at Las Vegas, brand new hockey stadium, they're at the top of the list for an NBA expansion as well. You look at other places, you build a stadium, you own the stadium, look at Boston, The Bruins own the stadium, the Celtics are tenants, more revenue. So if you go build that stadium in Kansas City, more potential revenue if you try to get a basketball or other sports team later. But yeah, thank you very much.
So can you go back to the superfan slide for a second?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and this is true of your revenue slide too. Hockey seems to be really high, and so I was wondering if that concerns you at all, from like that there's more superfans in Kansas City for hockey than there are for the Chiefs.
Sure. So we agree that we saw that, and that sort of jumped out as a red flag to us. Doing the sniff test on the St. Louis number was one thing that made us more confident. Another thing is that's kind of interesting. Each of these teams have a major hockey team within about a 4-hour drive, or if not 2. So it sort of made sense that with the recent success of like the Blues relative to Kansas City or Nashville relative to Louisville, that it would build up fan investment in the further reaching areas of the fan base. And so that's why we thought it sort of made sense in that way.
I'm curious just what your general hypothesis was going in. Did you have an idea of what you thought it was going to end up at? Because I'm guessing it wasn't Kansas City in hockey. Or maybe it was. I'm sorry. Shame on me for assuming, but yeah.
I mean, I think going in initially, we had basically no hypothesis. We probably weren't going to say add a baseball team to Kansas City probably would have been my first thought. But other than that, I think we were open to anything. I think probably about an hour or two in, we started to see that, wait, for some reason, Kansas City hockey is jumping off the page in a way that we were kind of surprised too. We did not expect Kansas City hockey to be higher. We checked the numbers, we double checked them, we triple checked them. We did a bunch of just basic like exploratory data analysis beforehand. It seemed like it lined up with our model results. It was surprising to us, but we feel confident in the work we did and double checking it that seemed pretty reasonable relative to our original analysis. But do you want to add on to that?
No.
Just a quick question. So looking at the Major League Soccer projections, how does that actually compare to the other teams in Major League Soccer? Is that actually, like for Kansas City, is that attractive or is that below average?
So I'd say if we had more time, we probably would have started to look at that. For us, hockey jumped off the page so quickly, and with a limited amount of time, we wanted to limit our scope of exploration. So I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately.
I'd also add, and I might be slightly off on this, so tell me if I am, but given that there is, I believe, a Kansas City MLS team, a Cincinnati MLS team, and that would only leave Virginia Beach as a potential logical expansion team unless you want to combine the markets of Cincy and Louisville, that might be something where that number is so low for Virginia Beach relative to the other options. We were probably less likely to go that direction, particularly given that there's already a market share for soccer in both of those other locations.
If you had 6 more hours, what would be at the top of the list for you guys to try and tackle?
Probably start to look at how this impacts the leagues themselves and relate the numbers that we got to league revenue and league revenue relative to ticket sales, so that you could turn this into a bit more of like a selling point for a league if you brought the proposition to them.
Time for one question from the audience.
Hello. I was wondering, when you were in your normalization phase and accounting for differences in your data, did you also account for variances in ticket cost per market, or did you build this model with the assumption that tickets were cost similar across the board?
I'd say because we were trying to normalize across all 3 markets, and specifically trying to predict event value per customer, we more so looked at the number of tickets as a normalization factor, but that would be definitely something we might add later on.
I think the one other part is I think the overall process was recognizing, like, for example, Kansas City already has multiple major league sports teams and like Virginia Beach doesn't, but we can look at how do more wealthy people spend money in Kansas City and then assume that will extrapolate more so towards Virginia Beach had a team existed, where it's not as fair to compare current Kansas City ticket buyers or current Virginia Beach ticket buyers because those options already exist. So I think that was also part of the process.
And to handle one thing, one of the probably confounding factors here that we would have addressed if we had more time was we didn't really address the problem of group buyers. We did try to filter by potential ticket brokers because there was a marker for that in the data set. But going back, we'd probably try to do a better job of filtering out the group buying tickets because we're trying to model individual behavior here.
Let's give it up for Xander and Lorenzo. Bella, you're up. And next up, we have Bella.
Hi. Oh, is this on? I didn't think so. Is this on now? Perfect. Okay. Hi, I'm Bella. I am also going to be explaining to you why Kansas City should get an NHL team, but I took a little bit of a different approach than the two guys we just heard. So my overall approach was taking all of this data and this big question and kind of narrowing it down to first a sport in question and then narrowing it further down to one of the three cities in question. So first of all, I focused on what sport would work best, and to do that, I used the average propensity scores given in the customer data set for each of these different team sporting events, because team sports is where I was focusing more from a revenue perspective. And I found that the average likelihood in the propensity scores was overall astoundingly bigger in hockey all across, with the exception of the Louisville basketball outlier, which I thought was worth mentioning. I did not take into consideration because even though they don't have a professional basketball team, they have the Louisville Cardinals, which is a very basketball-heavy college. So then I shifted focus to location, and for my preliminary research, I wanted to see if I could eliminate, numerically speaking, one of the cities. That didn't totally work out so well because I broke down all of these average likelihood scores in terms of various purchasing options and broke it down for each city by both total events and just sporting events in general. And they all increased in likelihood when filtering down to sporting events in about the same way, so that didn't totally help. But then I shifted more towards my exploratory research, and I looked at the professional sporting portfolio for each of the cities, and you could obviously tell that Virginia Beach, all 4 of the sports franchises in their portfolio had been discontinued for one reason or another, so I decided to focus on just Louisville and Kansas City. Finally, to make my final decision, I decided to do some very low-level research into comparable franchises in comparable cities and competitor franchises in the 2 respective cities. So I looked at the average sellout percentage of their home games for the 2022 season, or most recent season rather, for depending on the sport. And I found that for both the comparables and the competitors, Kansas City's average sellout percentage was much higher, was significantly higher than those of Louisville. So then that was all the research that I had time to do in that time frame. So from that research, I narrowed it down to Kansas City. However, if I had more time, I would certainly focus on doing much more thorough research on the comparables market. In terms of demographics, I would go through every single franchise in the NHL and do my due diligence in terms of city size, city demographics, age breakdown, what have you, to build a more accurate comparable portfolio. And then in addition, for competitors, I would look into the NCAA with like the Louisville Cardinals. And then over in Kansas City, you're kind of between the Missouri people, the Kansas fans, and all that stuff that's going on in the Midwest. And then one final thing that I would focus on that actually was inspired by hearing like all my colleagues yesterday in the hackathon was a lot of people looked at the age bracket breakdowns provided in the data sets, and I honestly didn't even think of that, and I thought that that was super, super cool. So if I had more time, I would focus more on that and see if I could find any insights that either proved or kind of steer me in a different direction. Thank you.
So you noted the high propensity for basketball in Louisville, and you suggested that because it's the Louisville Cardinals, that's not really fair. Mm-hmm. Explain why is that not fair? Like, why shouldn't we rely on that the same way we rely on all the other propensity metrics?
So I guess fair might not have been the best way for me to put it. I guess what I meant was that, I guess I'll just pull up the chart. That propensity average has the potential to be more skewed than the hockey averages due to the presence of a very popular NCAA basketball team right in that city, as opposed to the lack thereof of the hockey teams in the other three cities. So it's not necessarily unfair. It's just something that, again, another thing, if I had more time, I would look more into exactly how that data could be skewed. Oh, okay. Oh, well, I'm glad we covered that then. Anyone else?
Any questions from the audience? We can come back to the judges too. They've had some time to think again. Have more questions?
You mentioned that if you had more time, you would look at age as a factor. Is that something where you would look at age as a propensity factor for purchasing tickets? Or would you be using that more in conjunction with something like census data where you're projecting, okay, with the population aging at X rate, we can expect that that would impact our revenue over the next 10 years by Y?
So honestly, that's a great question. I feel like it could be anything. I think that it partially could tie into the more in-depth research that I do for the comparable franchises and looking at those respective cities' age breakdowns, and then looking at those comparable franchises, seeing if they do like ticket promotions for certain age groups, like if they gear their marketing a certain way. So it honestly could be a mix of the two things that you said, but that just depends on what would come through in the research.
Great presentation. One item that jumped out was the competitor analysis. It looked like there was a number of competitors in Kansas City. Do you see that as a barrier to entry for a new expansion franchise, or as an indicator of fan avidity for professional sports in that region?
Yeah, so honestly, like, I was kind of torn doing my research. I saw both sides of that. The way I looked at it was more of, I ended up looking at it more as the affinity for sports and the sports towns, especially with that in addition to the comparables, kind of looking at the whole picture and not any like isolated incident. I would have to do more like numerical analysis on that, but at first glance, I thought of more the affinity.
Any other questions? Cool. All right. Thank you so much, Bella.
Thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Oh, that might be a problem. Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay. Hello, my name is Gathanga Durango.
Hi, I'm Shreyan.
and this is our presentation on which city we think would have the biggest franchise or which city should get a franchise. We started our analysis by just doing some secondary research and just seeing like if having a sports franchise impacts the local economy, positively impacts the local economy. And through our research, we found out that having a sports franchise does impact the local economy, but it's very insignificant. It's a very small portion. And most of that is just because it costs so much to have a sports franchise come to just any city. So in that matter, like everything that the sports franchise brings, it gets counteracted kind of just by the cost of that. And then from there, we did our own EDA analysis of the behavioral and the dimensional data. And we found that for most of the behavioral and dimensional data for all three cities was pretty similar. But we found like if there is being an event hosted, that the cities had a good chance of having people buy parking passes to attend the events and also buy merch for those events, which was good. And then we also saw that the percent of live events sold per city was different with each city. So for Kansas City, we see that there's a very low events sold for family and for them to go to multiple events. So most of them will just go to one event one time and that's it. And then for Virginia Beach and Louisville, there was a low percent of family and art events. And I think Louisville's was a lot smaller than Virginia Beach.
Hi. Hi, so now that we know what the data looks like on the behavioral side, we'll try to understand what makes a franchisee. Because we're not trying to tell you what league or what sport you should open a franchise in what city, because what makes a franchisee? It's the ability of people to come back and pay money to buy tickets, the frequency that they buy tickets in, and the recency that they buy tickets in. So what we did is we fitted an ordinal logistic regression with these variables that we got through secondary research. And then what did we find for Kansas City? We found that the net worth goal, which is essentially the ability of people to spend in the middle class section, then we saw an affinity towards tennis and the maximum price that the client is willing to spend for a ticket. But why is, you might be thinking that, well, why are we looking at the middle class for spending in a franchise? Because those are the people who are in the trenches, who are buying tickets day in, day out. You're not looking at the wealthiest 1% who are booking out suits for the entirety. You want people who are engaged. You want people who will take the office off at 5 p.m. just to go to the game. Those are not your wealthiest 1%. That's for Kansas City. So for Kansas City, we suggest opening a tennis franchisee if that is the option that you can do. For Louisville, we see an immense propensity in soccer. And why soccer? We already know that the Louisville City, it's not yet at MLS, it's a division below it, but people are passionate about soccer. And dwelling type becomes very important. Why? Because and this is just from secondary research, a sense of community where everyone goes to the games together. That's a different sort of an idea. And the last variable which we say here is the first individual who's booking tickets, if that's a male or not. So you see a gender diversity coming here in Louisville, depending on who is booking the tickets and the kind of family that they're from. Lastly, we look at Virginia Beach, and again, we see that, that net worth, the family, the CD2, which is the lower middle class, becomes very important, and the probability sort of increases by a whole lot, close to 40%. And here also we see that people should we should open a tennis franchisee. Lastly, what does a net worth goal mean? That just means that the controlling for all the other factors, we know for a fact that Virginia Beach, the average income and the amount of money that people have to spend there is far more as compared to Louisville and Kansas City. So we suggest tennis for Virginia Beach. We suggest, again, tennis for Kansas City, and we suggest soccer for Louisville. Lastly, this is just a summary. We don't want to bias you with one particular sport or franchisee. So different locations offer similar things, but different ideas and intensity. One thing we wanted to sort of take it apart is college sports are very popular in certain parts of the country, but not so much as a professional sport. I'll take the example of where I'm from, Oklahoma. So we have the OU Sooners and the OSU Cowboys, but we don't have an NHL team. We used to have the Oklahoma Outlaws in the 80s, but we don't really have now. So that's a primary example of why college sports is not a fantastic indicator of professional sports. And with that, we conclude. Thanks for listening.
You said you're focusing on the middle class because they're the ones who are going to keep buying tickets and be the avid fans. But isn't the 1% the ones that are the most valuable fans? Like, don't we want a high number of folks who can afford those suites and luxury suite seats and things so we can really make money?
Two-part answer to the question. First, yep, so people who have more money have definitely the propensity to buy more tickets. But here the idea is, do you want people to just buy tickets and not show up? Or do you just, or because we've seen a classic example of soccer like Manchester City. There are enough rich people, but they can't, for the love of God, they can't fill people to fill up their stadium seats. So I will suggest that yes, they do help in sort of buying out the suits and everything, but to generate the atmosphere, what makes it count as a home advantage? I don't think we are looking at the wealthiest 1% to do that.
And I think it's also the passion of the fan base. Like, the middle class people will be the ones that will support with merch and everything, and they'll be the ones that like save up all their money just to go to that one game and then even that one event. So also just for the community too, it helps with that.
Really cool analysis. I enjoyed that. I am curious if you can expand a little bit on what a tennis franchise in the market would be. Is it a tournament? Talk a little bit more about that.
So what we propose is definitely to test out the waters. We will certainly suggest sort of a sister tournament of tennis, in the sense that like we have obviously the Australian Open, the US Open. We suggest a sister franchisee which probably doesn't get the top 50 players but gets everyone below that. So we actually test out the waters, and then if that succeeds, because that is going to draw people from all over the country and the world. So if we sort of understand that, okay, this works out, and we see a sort of local demography going there, like because the tournament is going to make money either way. So, and from that, we can sort of thinking about a league and something like that. Because right now, like I come from India, and right now we are having leagues of all sorts of games that we have never heard of. We are having leagues in kabaddi, we are having leagues in soccer. Cricket is already so big there. So yeah, so I think something like that would definitely benefit.
Any questions from the audience? Alrighty, round of applause.
Thank you.
So that concludes our 3 student finalists. We'll now pivot to the open division with John Henry and Colin.
Good afternoon. Okay, excellent. All right, let's kick this off. So for this hackathon, we actually chose Kansas City, and we thought a little outside of the box and went with esports. Okay, so first, why Kansas City, right? It has a growing interest in esports, as evidenced by the success of the Kansas City Pioneers, which already has a fan base and a following. We'll dive into that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And they already have a diverse and a growing population. The other 2 cities, their populations were declining and had been steadily for several years. And Kansas City also has a more youthful population. In order to make the new franchise profitable, Kansas City can leverage its existing infrastructure. It already has T-Mobile Center, state-of-the-art sports, and it can host esports events. It already has an esports arena as well as esports athletes that it can take advantage of. Esports as an industry is a little unique, where just because you have a team doesn't mean you're necessarily in a franchise. Each game is an individual franchise.
Oh, okay. So to kind of isolate Kansas City as our choice, we looked at the ticket pricing for a couple of different categories. We've got Kansas City coming out ahead with the top ticket pricing between $51 and $200 plus. They far surpassed the other two cities, Virginia Beach and Louisville. The nice thing with going with esports is that we didn't have to specifically look at any of the tickets for any individual sporting event, because we don't necessarily need to take away fans from any other activity that's happening in the city. They can be shared. They're not mutually exclusive. So besides that, the other nice thing is that we could look at all three cities equally. We didn't have to worry about bringing an NFL team to Virginia Beach, for instance, because Kansas City already has one. So it kind of opened the door for a lot of possibilities, and it was a definite choice to go with Kansas City.
Excellent, thanks. I'm just going to shuffle in. So as we mentioned, Kansas City already has the Pioneers. They're already established and growing. However, they're not playing the two most profitable esports franchises, right? They're playing Apex and Rocket League. With the most success in Rocket League, the most profitable right now is League of Legends, and CSGO is also another one. In 2022, they had 50 million impressions a month, which was up from 12 million impressions a month in 2021. This shows that they're actually trending up on globally, and they're growing globally, as is esports revenue in general. So in addition, esports revenue has been increasing across several facets in the United States that are relevant to an esports franchise: merchandise and ticketing, sponsorship and advertising, and streaming. All of this growth is occurring in Kansas City currently, and they aren't fielding teams, like I said, that are actively participating in the two esports franchises that are consistently in the top most streamed games and the games that actually can bring in the most revenue for tournament values.
Another thing to mention is the barrier to entry for esports is significantly smaller than bringing in an NFL team or an NBA team or an NHL team or even an MLS team to a city. So I think their initial seed round for the Pioneers was somewhere near $2 million to begin their team. It would be significantly greater to bring a League of Legends, for instance, franchise to the city, since something like that, just in franchising fees, cost around $12 to $13 million, with an annual franchising fee on top of that. But it is significantly smaller than trying to start up your own, build a brand new stadium and start up your own NBA team, for instance. I mean, you wouldn't be able to afford many players for $12 million.
And even with that, you can actually use the players that you're already paying and what you have. You can take them and just put them in the new franchise. So as you pay the franchising fee, which is, again, $13 million for the first year for League of Legends, as an example, $10 million following that, the costs other than that don't go up because you're already paying these athletes. So, and the team is already profitable and growing. And that concludes our presentation.
Questions?
Sorry, can you put that financing slide back up? Can you walk me through this? I'm just a little confused with what I'm looking at.
Oh, yeah. So this is just looking at all of the millennials' ticket purchases and the ranges for the average pricing.
So on the Kansas City one, there are 582 millennials who have purchased tickets in the 200 plus category?
Correct.
Okay. And so the basis, the reason this is an argument for Kansas City is that there are high numbers on the right side of this.
Precisely.
Okay. Don't they, because of the number of professional teams in Kansas City, don't all these people have a much higher opportunity to spend that kind of money than the folks in Louisville and Virginia Beach?
Correct.
So it's like, I guess my question is then, how do you adjust for that in using this as a case for Kansas City as the place to go?
That's a good question. I think if we had more time, maybe we could try to normalize a little bit better and adjust for that in the future.
So there isn't really anything specific to esports in the data set. I'm curious, and this is a great use of the ticket price and the age groups. Were there any other pieces of data that you took a look at from the data set to help this?
The other large one was the behavioral data. The scores for behaviors were great. Kansas City had the lowest scores for late buyers and low tier buyers, as well as the highest scores for early buyers and premium ticket purchases. So those ticket purchasers are buying earlier and often and paying a premium for them. Additionally, they were the most apt to travel more than 500 miles. So something like that tells me that their fans are willing to go, whether it's 650 miles away, wherever it may be. So they're eager, they're young, with an average age of around 36, and so I think it would be a good opportunity.
I think you mentioned market saturation, didn't you? So I'm kind of curious if that was kind of like why you felt that there wouldn't be so much, in other words, like the millennials are spending all their money on other sports and they're not going to have any money left over to spend it on esports. So there's kind of somewhat of a disconnect between the two sports. Is that?
I may be misunderstanding, or maybe I misspoke. I don't think we said market saturation. I think when we were talking about esports specifically, I gotta try and find my notes. Sorry for the metrics. I know we mentioned merchandising and ticketing, sponsorship and advertising and streaming. When it comes to what the millennials are willing to spend, the reason we focused on millennials specifically and those age demographics were because our research showed that esports is primarily popular with younger generations. And so it's not necessarily that there's a saturation that millennials don't have the money to spend. We're looking at where they could spend those additional dollars, as well as where their children and Gen Z would then start spending some of their money.
Just another quick question. So in terms of the cities, you mentioned the existing venue in Kansas City. So do you consider that kind of like bootstrapping as opposed to like maybe an esports league kind of bootstrapping onto an existing pro franchise in the city, which seems to be pretty common as well these days?
I think, yes, in that similar vein. I mean, at this point right now, Kansas City already has the Pioneers as an established team that people are coming to see. The way esports, so the Pioneers already have fans. The data shows their Twitch streaming views are increasing. They could choose to bring in new athletes for an additional franchise, or they could leverage what they already have on that team and then buy into a new franchise. Esports is a little different, where you don't have to go out necessarily and hire new people like you would if you wanted to bring in a hockey team and build a new stadium that way. You have to pay the fee to participate in a new franchise and make sure that the gamers you're paying can play competitively.
That puts us at time. Thank you, guys. Round of applause. We got Lucas up next.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, great, thank you. So I'm Lucas Moss, and I'm here to talk about my analysis for why I'm recommending an NBA franchise in Louisville, Kentucky. So starting off, I actually viewed the secondary research as a major component going into it, because I looked at 7 potential major U.S. leagues, which are listed there, and then times 3 and the number of markets we were looking at, you're looking at 21 unique combinations. So in order to think about, hey, what could our data set support, I thought it was very important to sort of narrow that scope down. So I did that by looking at factors like population, growth rate of the different markets, as well as attendance figures and trends for each league, as well as obviously the existing landscape for franchises customers in the area or in that particular market. Then from there, I pivoted to the data set we had access to look at how the customer live event propensity for that given market plus sport compared across the finalists. Looked at ticket behavior data, and then finally fit a customer attribute model to sort of reinforce and make sure that everything made sense at the end of the day. So a couple of the key findings from secondary research. All three markets are growing. Louisville and Kansas City twice as fast as Virginia Beach. And then from an attendance standpoint, because probably could have done secondary research almost all day, that data was a little mixed, hard to get through. So instead of specific numbers, I sort of more ballparked how I felt the trends were to identify sort of the current state of each of the leagues. One of the reasons I will call out for focusing on attendance is that since this was a live event sort of analysis, I thought that was important versus viewership or some of those other factors, which absolutely would go into a decision, but not as much as the in-person attendance. So from there, put together a view for how the different current franchises in each market stacked up, as well as you can see from the color coding here, the green ones are sort of that cross-section between where there's not an existing franchise and where some of the macro level factors were maybe strongest to get to my list of finalists. So this was the list of 7 finalists I looked at, and I started by comparing the propensity for that sport across each of the markets and the customer files we have. So that's the column on the right. The one thing I will call out is I ran it for both the overall. So in this case, basketball for Louisville is that 621 number, but we also had propensity for college, because one thought I had for Louisville that does jump out is they have the Louisville Cardinals, successful program, but you can see there that there's actually a pretty significant gap between basketball and college basketball, which to me spoke as potential opportunity. In fact, that gap between the two is even larger when you compare the overall versus the college for some of the other ones. So that's where I really started to focus in on Louisville basketball. So from there, I wanted to really dive into the different propensity levels for basketball and compare that to, okay, well, people who are Louisville sports buyers who have high propensity for basketball, does their ticket behavior purchase data back that up? Because those are the people that the city would be counting on, obviously. And as you can see at a high level, it does. So from A, which pretty much outperforms all Louisville customers, all Louisville sports buyers, to B, a little bit less so, and on down the list, you can see that there is a strong relationship there, which once again is what you'd want to see from that group. Then finally, I fit a model to test and sort of validate which customer attributes are sort of the most important potentially for this basketball target audience in Louisville. So the target were customers in the market who bought sports ticket or had sports spending greater than 0, and then the high propensity for basketball, which we were given was a propensity score greater than 650. Below that are a handful of the demographic variables that I tested, which were just a sample of the huge number that we potentially had, as well as the different behavior variables. And then the output that you see here is, 3 of the demographic ones really came back between presence of children in household, net worth, and the financial composite score. The great news for Louisville is those percentages for them, they were actually first among the 3 markets in all 3 of those. So once again, further reinforcement that the things that are tested that seem to matter, that are a match and a fit for that market. I wrote the model in R, meaning it can be easily refit for other sports, other markets to do additional testing. Obviously, ton of opportunity for additional customer attributes. And then finally, just last consideration or two, Louisville's also home to the KFC Yum Center, capacity of almost of over 22,000, which exceeds the average NBA arena capacity, so opportunity there. With a different data set, I think there's a possibility to explore more sports-specific ticket sales and transaction data. Obviously, opportunity for more variables on the customer attribute model. And then it would also be interesting to sort of broaden the scope of markets. We just had the 3, but in order to sort of get to more national benchmarks on some of this. So that was my analysis. Thank you all. Any questions?
I have a small one. You mentioned with your model fitting that you looked at customers with was it a 650 propensity score?
Yes.
Is that for basketball, or was that also, did you take into account college?
It was just for basketball. So basketball propensity, the general one, not the college-specific one.
Okay.
You mentioned the gap between propensity for basketball and then college basketball.
Right.
And you say that that's an opportunity. And tell me how you would, sort of take advantage of that to try and really document that that's an advantage in the marketplace, that difference between those two scores.
Yeah, well, the first thought that comes to mind would be data that we didn't necessarily have access to yesterday, but for example, if we had more of the sports-specific transaction data, the Indiana Pacers are the closest NBA franchise to Louisville. So I'd be curious, what does Indiana Pacer transaction data for Louisville customers look like? Are a significant number of people making that couple-hour trip, up to Indianapolis? That would be the first place I would start to really sort of quantify that and drill into that gap. So maybe not the best answer since we didn't have access to that data, but that's what I'd do in an ideal world.
Any questions from the audience?
First off, I just want to start off by saying fantastic presentation. I was
Thank you.
actually one of the student competitors, so I'm familiar first off with just how tough that data set could have been to work through, so very impressive.
Thank you.
Going back to something you mentioned in the beginning about like the macro look with the green, yellow, and red chart. I'm just curious, how did you determine what was a potential expansion area, a good expansion area? Was that through research? Was that more data-driven, or was that just simply through, I guess, just through like analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is the chart you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, so red, excuse me, I kind of marked red as in a franchise already exists. Doesn't necessarily, preclude the fact that maybe Kansas City could add another NFL team. I would argue maybe the market doesn't support that, so that's why those are marked as red. The yellow ones are definitely potential opportunities, but then going back to this slide here, I sort of narrowed it down on at least to the sports that I felt like had strong or potentially growing attendance trends to identify the green labels from the yellow ones from there. But honestly, given more time, I'd love to investigate sort of all of them. This was sort of just, hey, kind of have to pick a direction at some point and go with it. So I hope that helps.
Any other questions from the audience? All right, round of applause.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we've got Andrew and Hunter.
Test. Okay. I'm Andrew Stevens. I'm a quantitative researcher at Rotunda Solutions, and this is our Director of Research and Analytics, Hunter Moore. And we'll cut right to the chase. We believe that Kansas City should have its own NHL hockey team. Our methodology for selecting Kansas City for a hockey team, we started at the macro level and compared the sporting markets using alternative data from other sources. So these graphs you can see are the metro populations for each respective market. Louisville has the smallest population, followed by Virginia Beach and then Kansas City. And we also included population projections that come from the United Nations. And as you can see, in addition to having the largest population, Kansas City also is projected to have the steepest growth in the future, which makes it more attractive. Highlighted for you here. Beyond that, we also included a breakdown from more US Census data of income in these cities. Unfortunately, we cannot find a data source in the allotted time for Louisville, so we just have Virginia Beach and Kansas City. These don't match up perfectly to generations, but for the most part, Gen X is 25 and under, and then the next bracket is millennials, Gen X, and boomers. So we use this to compare to the data that was provided by Ticketmaster, which showed that millennials actually were the biggest demographic to hit, because 37% of ticket buyers are millennials, which would be the red bars on this graph. And in addition to that, the salary brackets of 50K to 75K and greater than 125K are the most important brackets there. So as you can see, in both those demographics, Kansas City is better than Virginia Beach. They have a lot more millennials in their market, which means they have more money to spend on tickets, and also they're younger, so they'll be spending money for a longer time.
Okay, so then we started going on a little bit further, and we thought, all right, what other things are going to drive whether or not someone is going to be interested in sports in that particular area? And so one of the things that we wanted to look at was kind of what we thought of as like a passion level for that particular piece, right? And so how far does someone want to drive to see one of those sports, right? So we started looking at the average distance of that. And from this, we saw that Kansas City, those guys are driving further than anyone else on average to see the events that they want to see, which really shows a lot of passion for their sport. So they're going 228 miles on average. And in addition, where the other two cities were looking at only 8% of people were going over 500 miles, which was another metric that happened to be in this data set, we saw 14% were going more than 500 miles from Kansas City, which really shows that they really want to see it, right? So that was another one that kind of pushed that way. Then looking through the data set, we found some other pieces, metrics that were developed by Ticketmaster, I believe. One of them was looking at this RFM grade, which was pretty handy, right? Recency, frequency, and monetary, right? So how recent have they purchased? How frequent do they purchase? And how much money are they spending while they're there? The two we were most interested in were recency and frequency, because getting people in there, that's the important piece, right? Eventually they get super into it, maybe they'll spend a little more money, but at least getting them in there. And one thing that we already did when we were looking at our data is we cut out people who hadn't bought anything in the past 5 years, because we want to see those people who are actually purchasing a little more recently. And so looking at this RFM grade, you can see that it basically broke it into an A, B, C, D grading based on how recent and everything. And so 85%, the first thing we looked at is, let's look at the top 50%, right, A and B. 85% of Kansas City were in the top half of that. You still had 82 with Louisville. More time, we would have put a little stuff into some statistical significance there, but for now, you can take our word for it. So 85% top half A and B. And then when you look at just the top 25%, so just that grade level A, you still got Kansas City in the lead. So what that told us is that Kansas City has the most active live sports enthusiasts, right? Because we care about live because we're working about the stadiums, right? Not just who's sitting on their couch watching TV. So that gave us another piece of Kansas City. So then your next question is, okay, which sport, right? So that's where we get to on this guy. We like hockey, so we said hockey. No, just kidding. So we started looking at hockey and football and everything. We took all the propensity scores. We looked at them across the board. We focus on sports based on the prompt that we were given as opposed to some of the other things. We focused on professional sports because we were focused more on bringing in leagues. And so looking at those propensity scores, we looked at that. They're all actually pretty close of what we were pulling out here. Now, granted, at this point, we've already decided, like, some of our colleagues were over there saying, you pick something, you start going with it at a certain point, you're starting to run out of time. We already decided on Kansas City here, based on all the other stuff, the other metrics that we showed you. So we were looking at sports. But we went ahead and showed the other cities and the propensity scores we pulled out from that. And they're all pretty close. But Kansas City, it has the 611. For you guys that didn't get a chance to look at the data set, it's basically anything over 650 is a strong propensity to go to that sport. So that's pretty decent. And then 40% of clients had a score over 650, so that really helped us out. And then since I messed up last time, let me go and finish up. There we go. You didn't get to cut me off this time. So we finished up with the Kansas City hockey there. If we'd had a little more time, some of the things we'd like to dive into would have been more along the lines of looking at like more of the demographic data. So we had some pieces we could go into, some of the income levels, dive into a little more of that. And one of the things that Andrew and I talked about a lot afterwards that we really wish we could have done is had access to more of a national level data set. So that way we could start doing some evaluation of, okay, we said Kansas City hockey, that's cool, but it'd be really awesome to see, how do Boston Bruins fans, how do they act? How do some of the Caps fans, how do they act? How do we pull that in and use that to really fortify our decision? Or come back and say, actually, maybe we were wrong. On the first guess, we were cool, but now we're a little wrong, and maybe we go with another one, so.
Thank you, guys. Round of applause.
Can you go back to the travel slide? Just a little curious about this, what this number is. So when you say Kansas City purchasers travel an average of 228 miles to events, is that like the maximum they've ever traveled for an event? Or just when they purchase tickets, they tend to go 228 miles on average?
Yeah, so one of the metrics that was in the data set was how far the venue was from the purchaser's address. And so we used that across the events of people who purchased in Kansas City and how far they were willing to go on the sports events.
So for anytime somebody in Kansas City purchased a sporting ticket, their average travel distance was 228 miles.
The average travel distance ended up being 228 miles. Granted, I know where you're going with it, and I would say, yes, I could put in median values as well as opposed to just the average. But
it's not exactly where I'm going. That seems like a really long distance for a city that has so many professional teams in it.
That's actually a good point. Yeah, I mean, that would be something that you would want to dive into further. Honestly, it didn't come up, at least for me, when I was doing it, but time pressure, we ended up not answering all the questions we would have.
I'd just like to add to that. Also, the only two major sports teams that Kansas City has are the Royals and the Chiefs, and Sporting Kansas as well. But the Chiefs have a pretty far travel schedule in their division out west, so that could be a major factor in why the average distance is so high. And also, since they don't have an NBA or a hockey team, their closest destinations are farther away, so it takes longer to get there.
Okay, so when Chiefs fans buy Raiders tickets to go to Vegas, that's
exactly.
all? Okay, got it. Okay.
You guys touched on the RFM score and did that really well. It's a good job there. I'm curious, just overall, if there were other metrics you saw that maybe didn't make it into the presentation, but you found to be really valuable.
Yeah, there were a few that we actually ended up cutting out, and I'm trying to remember what those were now. There were most of the other ones that we looked at. They didn't really differentiate a lot between the cities or a lot between the sports, and especially given yesterday's piece, and since we couldn't add in the stuff we didn't do yesterday, it didn't add enough to really differentiate, so we stripped them out in order to save time rather than showing more of the full story. Some of them, we would have liked to have done a little more background looking into it. Some of them were also, like this one, were secondary metrics to us, and so we would have preferred to do a little more diving into how that was developed to understand some of those pieces. And then some of them had a little more missing data than we were comfortable pulling into the analysis. But yeah, we did look at a few of the others, but like I said, most of them, I'm not remembering off the top of my head just because they didn't differentiate enough.
Got time for about one more question.
Hi, me again. I was just wondering, actually inspired by the judge's questions when he was asking about the average distance traveled for a fan, did you notice any correlation between the average distance traveled for fans and the urban density of the city itself? Did you notice if larger cities has shorter distances or larger distances based on population spreads, or was that not data that you had access to?
It's not something I personally noticed yesterday. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some correlation there. But yeah, just sifting through the data and only looking at 3 markets, it wasn't something that jumped off the page for me personally.
All right, round of applause for Hunter and Andrew. And let's do one final round of applause for all of our finalists and presenters today. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna give the judges some time to deliberate. Before that, I would love to get a picture with our 3 judges and our 10 or so finalists on stage, if y'all wouldn't mind. All right, so we're gonna have the judges deliberate, and everyone else, maybe if you want your own team picture, you can stand up there. Jeff, if we still have you, but we'll allow the judges to break, and anyone can get their picture taken. And we're going to give the judges some time to deliberate, but they will be coming out and announcing the winners for each pool. So everyone hang tight. Grab some coffee or a snack if you'd like.
All right, everybody. Thanks again. Wonderful job to all the contestants. Awesome presentations. I can't imagine how difficult that was yesterday to go through all those fields with the data dictionary and come to a conclusion. But we did have 2 winners that we have here. So congratulations in the open division to Lucas Ross. Yes. Yeah. And in the student division, congratulations to Lorenzo and Xander. Very good. Awesome job. Congratulations to the winners. We joked about trying to get like a big Ticketmaster check or something to go up here, but we couldn't make it happen. We'll go with the less sexy approach of you're going to get an email with a gift card in it. So please do look out for that. And congratulations again. Thank you, everybody, for participating.